Hi everyone. Today we have this lecture by Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri on sociology of gender. We have titled it Sociology of Gender and Overview, and you will get to see why it is so when I introduce our illustrious speaker, and then she goes on to speak. I'll be very brief, but yet want to introduce her and the purpose of this lecture a little bit. Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri has retired from the Center for the Study of Social Systems, CSSS, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. Her research interests have been on the making of the public discourse in modern India. Her early works have focused on questions of gender, nationalism, colonialism, and feminism in India. Since the early 1990s, she has been looking at the changing nature of public discourse in the context of both neoliberalism and the rise of majoritarianism. She was a DAAD visiting professor at Albert Ludwig University, Freiburg in Germany, and a visiting fellow at Harvard University, as well as the University of Massachusetts. Professor Chaudhuri was an expert on Asia for a feasibility study of women, intangible heritage and development, conducted by UNESCO and the Iranian National Commission for Culture in 2001, and the coordinator for the JNU Global Studies MA program in collaboration with the University of Freiburg, Germany, and University of Natal, South Africa. Her commitment to institution building and the development of the discipline is evident from her work as the president of the Indian Sociological Society up until very recently, and as a co-founder of Doing Sociology since May 2020. She is a leading Indian feminist sociologist whose work has been central to the development of gender studies in India. Her scholarship critically examines how gender is embedded in public discourse, particularly in the context of liberalization and globalization. Her books on gender include Refashioning India, Gender, Media, and a Transformed Public Discourse, Indian Women's Movement, Reform and Revival, and Feminism in India. Some of her other published articles only on gender include Gender and Advertisements, The Rhetoric of Globalization, Feminism in Print Media, Feminism in India, The Tale and Its Telling, Indian Media and Its Transformed Public, Gender in the Making of the Indian Nation State, Learning Through Teaching the Sociology of Gender, and Indian Modernity and Tradition, a Gender Analysis. I'm sure that this lecture will benefit particularly young scholars who are trying to probably work out their arguments, keeping in mind the vast literature that we have on gender at this current juncture. And the purpose of this lecture is to build an argument which the speaker will do through her works. Welcome, ma'am, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, for inviting me and forcing me to get back into the classroom mode. So as Rituparna has said that, I'm speaking on sociology of gender and overview. And once, when she called me and I said, yeah, that sounds good. And once it was announced, I got a little nervous because there seemed to be a lot of different sets of expectations about what I was going to speak on, which was a good kind of response because some felt that maybe I'm going to talk on feminism and sociology, maybe on the contributions of feminist scholars in India and to the contribution or to gender as a category. I realized that the topic was so vast, so capacious, that I could enter it in any way I wished to. And I thought that maybe it demanded a couple of caveats to start with before I begin on what I intend to focus on. Interestingly, I come from a generation which entered the university around the late 1970s, and much of my school life, my college life, and the university, where I joined my master's in 77 to 79, there was nothing called gender. There was no course on gender, and the only way we understood gender was, in those days in English, you did Wren and Martin. So it was masculine, feminine, neuter. It was a marker of grammar. Gender was specific to the question as a marker of grammar. It had no other meaning. But from the 70s, when you had what is called the second phase of the women's movement, things started changing very rapidly. And you started having an entire discussion about the absence of women. So when we started our MA, there was no courses on gender, but gender was not even a term discussed. What was being discussed was women's studies, women's movement. Now, that's a question which would force me to look into what I feel is the biography of the concept of gender. That how did the concept gender come into play? What is it that made it important for us to understand that gender is not just about women, not just about men, not just about trans people, and not just about individuals or individual attributes. It is about, and that's where I come in with sociology of gender, is how do we as sociologists or social scientists look at the concept of gender? Is gender about me being a woman or somebody else not being a woman? Or is gender an organizing principle of society, something which structures our lives, something which defines not just my personal life, my private life, but also my public life? So if there is an election, are the political parties targeting me for a particular kind of proposal, maybe some money, certain kind of specific programs? Are they marking me out? And then you realize, okay, so gender matters in public policy. Gender is about gender budgeting. Gender is about the whole question whether advertisements use gender in a particular fashion or not. So it is pervasive. Today, it is not absent as it was in the late 1970s, and yet in its pervasiveness, there are certain gaps or certain questions which are yet to be talked about. So I may be speaking, I often feel that when I speak on gender, I sound passé, that what I say and what I may appear is outdated in academia. Then why am I talking about these things? Things have moved so far away. We don't even use the word women or women's studies any longer. We use the word gender. We don't even begin with what at one point we began with as sex versus gender. And we would argue that obviously both sex and gender, there is no complete, absolute divide, and both could be performative. So it becomes much more blurred. So in such a context, is it worth going back? Is it worth going back to biographies of concepts, which I feel is located in the biographies of societies? Because concepts are located in context. Just like I mentioned about my own life, biographically, academically, that we finished our master's and our MPhil and our PhD without any course on gender. So that was a very different kind of time. But what we were exposed to was the absence of institutional courses on gender, but a pervasive presence of the women's movement all around us. So questions from the outside of the academia impinged into the classroom, bringing back the question, what is the relationship of concepts to context? How do concepts emerge? Is it an intellectual, abstract exercise which happens in textbooks alone? Or are they emergent from society? Where did this issue of gender emerge? And for that, we realize we have to underscore the relationship between society, social movements, and scholarship, because it was the women's movement which pushed forward women's studies, and it was the developments in social movements much later with the queer movement, the trans movement, caste and gender movement, that the complexity of gender as a category emerged. So at no point, I feel, we can understand the biography of a concept completely intellectually. We have to go back and see institutionally how do they work. Say, for example, today everybody would say that they know the distinction between sex and gender. But in the social sciences and in sociology, no debate is finally clinched. We just have new possibilities of knowledge. new ways of understanding, but there is never a shut door. It's closed and dusted, because that would be contrary to the whole question of knowledge. So today, a lot of young people would be familiar with binary, intersectionality, performativity, agency, negotiation, gender integration, mainstreaming, empowerment, transgender, sexual orientations, heterosexism, sexism, homophobia. Imagine a time when we began, when we barely were touching about on sex and gender. Does it mean that all these new terms are absolutely startlingly new, or are they certain small incremental changes which also revisits earlier questions? For example, intersectionality, as we know, became a term which became very popular with Crenshaw's work looking at the intersection of race and gender and class in the particular context of certain kinds of legal categories, legal provisions, and rights of Black women. However, in our country and in many other parts of the global South, it was very early realized that we can't do gender as a solo category. And so you would have very early writings like Tarabai Shinde's Sri Purush Tulana, which was already looking at, they may not have used the word intersectionality nor feminism, but they were already looking at the manner in which colonialism, feudalism, Brahminical caste structures, gender, patrilineality, morality were all intertangled. We had to re-look at that. But when they were writing, when you had debates on the women's movement, when you had women's organizations, when we had women in the Constituent Assembly in our own country discussing questions of rights of gender, they were not using the terms that we use today. And yet the terms that we use today do offer us insight into looking into our past. So I think we have to also look at the manner in which these categories have to be looked at from what I would call a sociology of knowledge perspective. A kind of looking at gender as a knowledge concept, as yet another tools, as of how do we look at. Some people use the word human lens. And in this, I feel we have a very, very specific kind of relationship to reality as compared to natural sciences. Now, when in natural sciences you talk about pressure or you talk about temperature, you're talking and you measure them and you have mechanisms to test them. They are being done in a world completely cut off from the social world. The natural science doesn't get up and say, you've excluded me, where is my voice, how am I being represented in measuring this temperature? The natural science is an object. Their world does not come in to our natural science knowledge. In contrast, in the social sciences, the sociologist or the sociological observer has access to mutual knowledge, whereby they can orient themselves to the people they observe. They know that this is why the woman is not speaking when she's in front of male members of the family when you're doing your field investigation. You already have access to the mutual knowledge. You also know they may conceal, they may in fact exaggerate, and you use your common sense knowledge to make sense of the sociological knowledge. It's a completely different ballgame as compared to the natural sciences. But the problem becomes even more acute because the concepts of social science, once they come into being, however they may come into being, movements, policy measures, however they may come into being, they become so familiar that we, as lay actors, as women, men, mothers, daughters, sisters, professors, domestic workers, peasants, we start using those categories in our everyday life. We become so familiar with these concepts that they are no longer restricted to a professional discourse. And Giddens has a very interesting book called, the whole question of in defense of sociology, where he has a couple of essays. And in one of the essays, he gives examples, and people earlier, like Charles Taylor, has also talked about it, because very often in sociology or social sciences, people would ask, but y'all don't do anything dramatic like the physicist or the astronomer or the scientist does. Your discoveries are so banal. The problem with our discoveries is, like gender, is that it gets embedded in society. And he gives the example like liberal democracy is a concept which emerges and then becomes embedded in the practice of democracy. So today you could even have a war saying we want to bring democracy. So they bear on social action. Now, this is a very tricky kind of thing, which he calls double hermeneutic. And in the case of gender, this has happened in a very big way. So if you want to understand gender and understand how gender is not just a concept, but in the 50 years since 1975, it is embedded even in our everyday practices. Going back to somebody which we normally do not invoke in sociology, in studying gender, Durkheim, when he talks about rules of sociology, he says that, look, human beings don't wait for sociology to define the meaning of institutions like family or religion or whatever, or nation. Likewise, people didn't wait to be told what women were or men were or queer was or trans. They already existed. They existed, and social scientists had to work on that. But when they worked on that, they redefined it. So, for example, family, and you would have now a lot of people would say, look, these laws on dowry are so terrible. You have people who are being implicated in false cases. And others would say, look, it's this law which has given me some space to fight back, which means human beings, ordinary people, not sociologists, would also use these laws which the state has brought about in order to create spaces for women, for human rights, and they could also be used against them and against manipulated because the human beings are actors. But these laws came into being not just like that, but because there was a women's movement, because law was seen to be as gendered, and you would have protests and you brought in certain kind of laws. But the state was not the only actor to use gender. The market used gender. For example, in my early work on advertisements, I saw that women or gendered identities were so very central to mark an advertisement because it would, if you look at Goffman, be the easiest way to communicate a whole series of expectations, identities, etc. Marriages, kinship, intimacies, everything, new ideas of gender, which has come about through academics, policies, etc., feed back into society and gets used in multiple ways. So it becomes extremely difficult, and I wanted to bring in this contested framework to say, what is then gender? How do we begin the story? And I want to begin it by saying that telling the tales of how this concept of gender emerged is a contested story, and I would like to take it in this contestation in the manner in which I narrate it. And since the topic is called Sociology of Gender and Overview, I want to bring back the sociological perspective. And I've thought it's fit because the platform is Doing Sociology. And the first distinction between the common sense view and sociological perspective is gender is something unproblematic, self-evident, uncontested. So the whole question of the resilience of the biological question of sex, that isn't it obvious that you're a woman? Isn't it obvious that you're a man? Isn't it obvious that you're queer? Is it not obvious that women are supposed to be this or somebody else is supposed to be doing that? Is the obviousness which makes it extremely difficult to challenge. And sociologists, on the other hand, see everything as problematic, and they do not accept the way things are, and they say, look, we need closer scrutiny. Now, how do we do this closer scrutiny? Does it mean that sociology alone can provide information and knowledge about gender? No. Sociology only offers us a very useful and distinct vantage points from which the topic can be understood. Fiction, music, art, everything can afford you certain kind of thing. But sociology has a distinct intellectual social location. That intellectual social location makes us look back at the assumptions with which we operate, the words that we use, and go back to what we say, that are we locating gender correctly? So in the contemporary discourse, we very often, particularly when I had to talk to young people, they would see gender as residing in the individual, as something about identity. Am I a woman? Am I not a woman? That kind of question. What kind of woman I am? Or bring in questions of intersectionality, again, bringing in the individual as the locus of that identity. Interestingly, when Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, Crenshaw is not talking about the individual attributes. Crenshaw is talking about a system by which she argued in the United States context that the race movement, anti-race movement, forgot Black women. And the women's movement forgot Black women. And she talks about this as a systemic error by which certain things were missing and the reasons for that to happen. So the first question that as sociologists we need to ask is, does gender reside in the individual? Is it something about being masculine or feminine or queer? And as sociologists, is the first negation that we have to do, that it may manifest itself in the individual, but it is not something which stems from the individual. Because when you have this assumption, just 1 minute, please. Because once you have this assumption that gender is something which is about us as an individual attribute, then all the other kind of very standard measures are suggested to resolve it. That if it is an individual attribute, we can change it. And if we learn this, if it's a learned attribute, then socialization, which is a central apparatus of gender reproduction, if we change our mindsets through gender re-socialization, then things should work out. But that's not how it takes place. And therefore, as sociologists, I think it's extremely important to look into what we call social structure. There are, in certain senses, subject to change, but pretty resistant to change, certain family kinship, questions of patriarchal order, line of descent, property inheritance, the manner in which the state looks at the question of family, marriage, kinship, the manner in which they look at the question of women of a particular caste or women of a particular class or community is fundamentally not just a question of mindset. It's also about categories. It's also about how you measure them or how you conceptualize them. And this is an example I repeat very often. After the report towards equality in 1975, many of the members of the committee started raising question about why are women workers not sufficiently represented in the census? And the census is, after all, only numbers. And they said, is it a neglect? Is it sort of patriarchal attitudes of people who come to count people in a household, or is it something more fundamental? And they came to the question, it's about definition of work. How is work defined? And if work is defined by experiences of the middle class, professional working men, then obviously a lot of women and a lot of men would be left out, and particularly women in large numbers, because they don't do the kind of work as most of us as people who teach in the academia do. So you need that conceptual redefinition. It's not just about mindsets telling, look, we must be gender just now, we must be fair. It is about categories and concepts. So the concept of gender has to be understood as an integral part of the host of organizing principles of society by which our society is structured. So if gender is an organizing principle of society, it organizes family, it organizes kinship, it organizes marriage. In a patriarchal society, in a patrilineal society, it decides whether we are going to have the girl who moves out of her natal home and goes to her husband's family. Is it patrilocal? Or how would it be looked at in a matrilineal society? It organizes the arrangement of society. It's a very, very different set of a ball game. It's completely different when we bring in questions of structure and whether state policies take into account these questions of how it is being structured. Many, many, many decades ago, when I was looking for a job, I got a job to do a kind of evaluation of what was then called integrated rural development programs in northeastern India. And we found that one of the main complaints of the beneficiaries were that there were women who looked after pigs. They wanted money for piggery, but their women was not considered as the head of the household, and only women, the men were considered as the head of the household. Now, again, you had the kind of going back and seeing the relationship of women's movement, raising new questions, women's studies being impacted by women's movement, moving into questions of policy, where beneficiaries then or head of household were redefined as something that men or women too are could be heads of household, and empirically demonstrated that they were, heads of household. So the concept of gender and its biography becomes very, very important. Now, this biography has very different stories to tell depending upon where you are trained. Where did you study? What kind of theoretical approaches, guided you? Which particular historical moment did it become important? At what point did questions of sexuality become more dominant? What was the role of trans movements? What was the role of queer movement? How did the question where a lot of women's movement centers for women's studies were called Center for Gender Studies? Now, when you bring in gender, does it just mean bringing in different identities, or does it mean the construction and production of genders, whatever it may be, at different historical moment? So when I look at the category of gender, I feel the biography of gender becomes extremely important, and that biography of gender has to be put forth in the context of the other institutions in society, including the academia, including women's studies, including feminist studies. Gender studies have been often to the critique of people who felt women's studies should be retained, saying that gender studies, say even in my own classroom when I used to teach it many decades ago, and I've mentioned it in one of my writings, that a lot of people felt that gender studies sounds more neutral. Women's studies, they felt, sounded more about women. And gender studies seemed more inclusive and more neutral. But the problem is, if you look at women's studies and its emergence, it is not neutral, because the question of gender emerges in unequal conditions. It's not just about difference, it's about inequality. It's about structures of power and economy and culture which reconstitutes questions of gender and gender identity. It is far more complex than that. And therefore, when people feel that using the word women's studies may be passé and using the word gender studies may not be, it is more problematic than that. The story is not unilinear. Gender studies may not be inclusive, and it may be inclusive. Women's studies necessarily led to questions of masculinity and the realization that gender is relational. But when you say relational, it is again not about men and women as individual identities, but it is about the structure of relations which define malehood, femalehood, or questions of hegemonic masculinity or subaltern masculinity, or various kinds of caste and gender questions. So the gender's biography is important to look at. The other reason when we do sociology of gender is the realization that gender matters in social life. It matters because it's one of the forces that contributes to the existing gendered society that we live in. However complex it may be, however intersectional may be, it also makes us realize that the whole question of looking back at the category of gender is far more than where I began from, a question of an individual attribute. It's a question of social structure, of class, caste, race, tribe, nationality, but bringing in not again as identities, but as again structural and institutional relationship. Now, sociologists and social scientists have not all agreed on what gender has to be about. And all the scholarship that has emerged in the past 5 decades and more, and not just in the past 5 decades and more, which has prompted us to look back with modern and very new understandings of gender into past practices and writings where gender was not looked at or gender was not used. So you have also a shifting views of particular categories which are there. Finally, before I finish, I want to bring in the question of feminism and ask this question, how do we tell the sociologies of gender? Does it begin with feminism? What comes first? Are the movements first? Is it gender first? Is it women's studies first? What comes first? Because I think it's important historically to map it and historically to understand what we mean by these terminologies. The idea of gender disparity, gender inequality is very, very old. If you look at a work, the 2 volumes by Susie Tharu and K. Lalita, you will see that their writings may be Buddhist women writers, or you have writings in the medieval period. You have people talking about women, talking about gender. What is it which is different? It is different in that sense. It emerges in literature, it emerges in poetry, it emerges in that kind of writing. It does it, but the beginning of social sciences in modernity transforms the manner in which we look at the gender. Because social science, in a certain sense, not philosophy, but sociology, political science, economics, are modern disciplines. It doesn't mean that gender begins with modern disciplines. What it means is that we have a particular take of how we look at gender. So gender oppression, gender angst is ancient. You can look back at our epics, re-looking at the kind of way women and men were looked at. We can look at into the ancient past, but from the contemporary. So looking back from the tools that we've acquired today, which is a completely different kind of tool. So those distinctions are very, very important to have, and to realize that, look, feminism as a modern political movement is new. We begin the usual story of the suffragette movement, the working class movement, labor movement in our country, inextricably connected with the anti-colonial movement, feminisms and nationalism and anti-colonialism, the questions of labor movement, peasant movement, Adivasi movement, anti-caste movements. We rediscover them. Remember, prior to the second phase of the women's movement, how many people would know about the anti-caste movements, about Savitribai Phule? How many people would know? So they emerge they happen at a particular time, they get rediscovered at another particular time. So gender has to be understood in that moving, transforming way, and not have any kind of fixed final solution that this is feminism, this is gender, and everything else is gone far behind and we don't have to look into it. It's a complex question, but a powerful question. And I think we need to look at it a little more seriously. And there has been amazing work done by scholars in the past. There's amazing scholars who are doing very, very new kind of work, areas which we did not talk about. And so you have new kind of empirical findings which are coming about, new conceptual tools. But in the case of social science, the old is never very old and the new is never very new. which does not mean that knowledge does not move, but knowledge moves incrementally, sometimes dramatically, but we always need to go back and say, where is it coming from? What is it which is being transformed? I'll stop at this point and thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was quite an interesting trajectory of how you've discussed the evolution of gender. So we are open for questions and answers. In case if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, or if you want to ask, please unmute yourself and ask the question. Ramyani, do you want to ask a question?
No.
May I?
Yeah, Lina, go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for that brilliant exposition. You know, there are two things that struck me, and it's interesting because just today I got back from a session where I had to speak to a bunch of law students about sex, gender, and sexuality. And, as you rightly say, there's nothing new. Even if there is old, we go back and try to discover it in new ways with the tools that are available to us now. And these concepts are evolving, constantly evolving. The way we looked at sex and gender earlier, the feminists themselves brought about this distinction between sex and gender initially, so that, it was so that one could deal with the whole question of biological determinism. But today, of course, we say that sex is also social as much as gender. But what I feel when we are sort of addressing the Gen Z and this young scholars, somehow, when you spoke about women's studies and gender studies and the transformation that has happened, people say gender studies is more inclusive, maybe it's gender neutral, but somehow there seems to be a greater acceptance of gender studies. So I had this couple of students telling me today, so nice, so good, ma'am, you also spoke about men. I mean, I was referring to Sanjay Srivastav's work on how does one understand gender. It's not just a relationship between men and women, but also between and among men and different kinds of men. Somehow they seem to be at ease with this. And if one begins with a very and this is what I've done in my classes with a very radical notion. Probably people who are doing sociology, you have the space and the time to deal with this. But when you're addressing different constituencies, like law students, for example, and the time is limited, somehow they seem to be at ease. When you're trying to say, well, it is systemic and all of us can be patriarchal. How does one deal with this? I mean, I really want to know from you, what is it that makes them very comfortable the moment you bring in men into the conversations and you say that, yes, it is important to bring them? So how does one look at it?
Yeah, it's a tough one, Should I come in, Rituparna?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I actually had similar experiences, Lina. And I remember that when it first began, so the early years, this response wasn't there. Say the late 70s, early 80s, because it was new and the oppression was tangible. Even among middle class and privileged background, like you would have a cousin who's been packed off home for dowry reason. You had middle class women being burned to death. You had very obvious forms of oppression, and there was a certain acceptance that this was wrong. Importantly, Lina, we have to realize that the classroom is extraordinarily powerful, but works within the larger matrix of state, market, and the larger public discourse. We've had definitely, I think in the 2000, I'd written this thing on feminism in the media, there has been a backlash. There has been hostility. There would be in my classroom, in the early years, there was a lot of supportive camaraderie, comradeship, that we're all in it together. And then you had this sense, okay, if we're all so equal, why do you have separate queues in railway stations? Okay. Or, that kind of pat reply, and everybody would snigger. So there would be a backlash, and that backlash is supported by larger backlash in society. And I think it is up to us to say, that's why I gave you the examples. There are people who manipulate women's laws for their own benefit. We know that. There have been cases about it. We have to take that into account, but does not alter the fact statistically, to be crude, that there would be hundreds and hundreds and thousands of women who are being badly battered, and they would need these laws to help them. In fact, I think I find this question of personal angst and public positions very useful. So, for example, somebody would always tell me these women's organizations break up families. And the same person had once come many decades ago saying that, my sister's been pushed back from her family and she's being beaten up. I want the name of a women's organization to go for help. So there is this sense, which is very deep in our construction of morality, that if we behave ourselves, these things won't happen. They happen to bad people. If we follow the norms properly, it won't happen. And when it happens, then they realize, okay, this is something I should go to. So it's a very dramatic way by which then the personal becomes political. Because a lot of people, only when it really impacts them, they are willing to do it. So I think there's a larger backlash, and I think a sense of a very unfortunate understanding of neutrality. It's like saying, I'm neutral in a war. You bomb people out, I'm neutral. I'm neither on this side nor on that side. So it becomes, instead of saying, going into the details of it and having some broad principles of equality and justice, So you would have, there's also the problem with young people, and not just young people in the classroom, when you're drawn to new concepts, So when you would say, oh, it's not just about women, it's also about men, it's also about other multiple, it's not a binary. And then you get caught in the magic lure of concepts. It's very difficult then to escape it and talk boring stuffs about data. So I think sociology is so extraordinarily powerful because you can use the imagination and you can bring in empirical data that, look, this is the number of cases, maybe in the Bombay High Court. Let's look into it and find out, because otherwise, how do you win a debate like this? This is just impossible, But I think it has shifted from one time. So people are very happy to talk about, say, sexuality. But the whole issue is that when the women's movement in the 70s, the main case was the Mathura rape case, okay? It is about caste, class, sexuality, gender, power. But how often do we explain sexuality with actual instances like this? Where it happens. It's also that you've had, and I think Pushpesh has done some fabulous work with neoliberalism, culture of consumption and choice and individuality, where you feel it's a matter of choice. So when you say it's not binary or it is fluid, you see it as one more exercise of your personal choice. So it's complex, and therefore I feel it's important to look into historicizing, There's some wrong...
Yes.
Garima.
Let me read this question out for everyone. Thank you, ma'am. How has the teaching of the concept of gender evolved in classroom setups? Has the curriculum and reading list leaned more towards women and their issues? Ma'am gave some examples, but how to deal with questions about gender, for example, gender neutral laws, as in classrooms, especially in those institutions which talk about liberal studies, and the student acts and talk like an individual and not take into consideration the societal constructs and structures. Asking them to use sociological imagination becomes challenging in such scenarios.
Yeah, it is challenging. I agree completely. And I think the idea of an abstracted individual, and that's why I brought in that double hermeneutic of Giddens, because abstracted individualism is not something which just happens in neoclassical economics. It's embedded in us. Like, I feel terrible if somebody says, oh, y'all are all like that, because we always feel we are unique. In some cases we are, but I'm sure in our everyday action we know, okay, those people must have studied in so and so. Oh, Bombay women look like this, or Mumbai women look like this, or Delhi women look like this. We have categories, right? And these categories are which we operate with. But our ideology, if you want to use the word dominant ideology, is that there's something so that we actually have full volition. We have the choice and the will. And so so what I do is really my choice, which it isn't. And somehow you feel you become less if you say that you're socially constructed. The same person who would be very upset saying that you're being socially constructed would be quite happy to say everything is social construction and biology is socially constructed, So I mean, you would have this anomaly. So I agree with you, Karim. It's a challenge. And I think what we need to do, have more forums where there's a general discussion, which then feeds into the classroom. Because the classroom is a difficult place, because there can be polarization, there can be, smart ones being cracked. And when you teach gender, there's a lot of, I don't know how the composition of classrooms for gender have changed. In our times, I did an optional because gender, women and society in India was optional. In the early years when I taught, it was like a lot of men, a lot of women. Okay. And then as the years went, it became more and more women and less men. And then in my last years, there would also be, people who would come overtly to claim their identity as non-binary or, in gender. So I think the outside does play a role into it.
I think we have one more question. Yeah. How can we adopt a balanced and nuanced approach while teaching sociology of gender so that we critically address inequalities without reinforcing biases or stereotypes? At times, it's hard, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. You see, Kamala wants to make a comment. Please do. Yeah, so I agree with the whole question but when we say critically address inequalities without reinforcing biases, that's the whole sociological training. That's why I wanted to speak on the category gender from a sociology of knowledge perspective. That how it is not just about difference; it is about inequalities. And we live in an unequal world. We don't live in an equal world. And as long as you have gender inequalities, caste inequalities, tribe inequalities, class inequalities, we can never be neutral. The word gender is not neutral. We would have no word called gender or no category as gender if we had a gender neutral society. The irrelevance of that term would itself go. There's one thing on manosphere. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I guess Gen Z, we say Z becoming more conservative. Not necessarily. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Right? It's a mixed thing. This is Anjali Yadav, I think, right, Rituparna?
Yeah.
So, ma'am,
I think,
can I
yeah.
add something? Yeah. Firstly, thank you, ma'am, for this very, very insightful presentation and talk. So, looking at all the comments and listening to all the questions and answers, I just wanted to flag something and also know your opinion on it. So recently I was reading up something on social media where so there's this recent debate about some Bollywood song and this Bollywood actor Nora Fatehi performing something which got banned for very vulgar lyrics and quote unquote vulgar lyrics and for its male gaze, right? So I was reading up about how Nora Fatehi kind of comes out in interviews and podcasts where she says out loud that she does not consider herself to be a feminist. She believes in equality, but she's not a feminist. And then such kind of debates come into the play, whereas there are records, there's data where dancers who are from marginalized communities in West Bengal, in Chhattisgarh, Bihar, and several parts of India. And there was data of dancers being shot at festivals or some events or something, whereas someone like Nora Fatehi, who has the kind of power and the audience, chooses to go out and say things like that. And I believe that students today kind of receive just that Nora Fatehi part of the story and not these news. So how do we really discuss that, and how do we really address that gap?
I think we need another discussion on this because it's a challenge now because social media, WhatsApp have become sources of primary sources of knowledge, right? Reels have. So in this context, it's really an unequal world. So we'll probably have to discuss the manner of knowledge production and dissemination in a world where the digital has acquired the kind of proportion it has. It's instant and unequal. So perhaps doing sociology could do something about this, right, in future?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. I think Professor Kamala Ganesh wanted to say something.
Yes.
You're on mute. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, going back to the original question on sociology of women, feminist sociology and sociology of gender, like Maitrayee, I have also gone through that phase when we first started sociology of women in Mumbai University way back in the 80s. There was a lot of discussion on whether we should call it feminist sociology or not. And it was decided that we should not put the word feminist in the paper. You can use it in the syllabus, you can mention it in other contexts, but not to name the paper in that way, because it delimits in some way. This was one of the arguments used. But after that, sociology of women went on for some time, and then it became sociology of gender, which was more inclusive. People felt more, both people of all sexes and genders felt more easy with that term. That is true. But there was this danger that it would then become very apolitical. It would become a very neutral and apolitical kind of term. But as a matter of fact, the way things have progressed in the last few years, I have moved in the last few years, sociology of gender, if it is named as such, even if it is named as such in courses and in the way it is taught and in the way research is done, definitely feminist approaches, feminist lens comes into play. Even when you are studying queerness or studying masculinity, the lens can still be a feminist one. The argument that many of us make is that your lens and methodology can be feminist, but you can study men or women or society as a whole. Institutions can also be studied in terms of macro institutions. What are the values they promote? How are intimate relations? How do they make a difference to corporate life? So the term, I think, sociology of gender, with all its limitations, in a way, I think it encompasses the arguments of feminist sociology and of women's studies and so on in the ideal context, and yet allows it to be a little broad and inclusive. As of course, anything can be inclusive or not inclusive also, it's the way you handle it. But I think that seems to have stuck now. That's anything, gender studies and sociology of gender has been broadly accepted, and with it some of the feminist understandings have become now commonplace or common sense. Not all and not all the politics of it, but much of what we had to argue about are generally now in the ambit of sociology of gender. They have become fairly acceptable. So there seems to be a move towards keeping sociology of gender, not to exclude feminist sociology or sociology of women, but this seems to be the trend. I'm just making a comment.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I think we have to make a distinction between what we study, because there is this common sense assumption: if you do women's studies, you study women. That's not the point. The object of inquiry could be anything. It could be the state. You have a feminist analysis of the state, or your own work on the household. The object of inquiry can be multiple. It's your perspective. I mean, it's a kind of comparison which is not made often nowadays. But say you could have a Marxist approach to understanding labor, but you can have an understanding of Marxism to understand the state or the industry or anything in the object. It is an approach, which is doing that. And also
Approach
the
and
fact,
methodology also.
methodology.
Methodology.
Absolutely. I mean, how do you do? How do you?
Matter per se.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Just wanted to add that comment. Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to add something in terms of the pedagogy, because we're all sort of struggling with that as people teaching in the classroom. I don't think it really matters even if you tell them that you want to practice neutrality, etc. At the end of the day, the classroom continues to remain a polarized space, and those who listen will listen, and those who don't somehow don't. But one thing which has worked a little bit, particularly because I've taught engineering students for the last 3 years or so now at Thapar and IIT, they're very resistant to ideas of gender. But if you give them practical examples through things that they can relate to, particularly of representation and inclusivity, they make sense, because the very fact that you can point out that there is diversity in the representation, and it's not only about upper caste women, it is about all women, women from different corners, and you bring in those examples. For instance, if you tell them that, because of this, Draupadi Murmu can become the president, they get it. They may not get it through an example of, very sophisticated language many a times, but then they do see the benefits. So it's a big struggle for all of us in the classrooms. I think they're very polarized spaces. Lena agrees, she's nodding. And anyone, who is in those spaces are facing a lot of struggle, because they're getting all the information through social media. But we still have to have some strategies, and maybe these representations, inclusivity, they become one, and sometimes I think not even the preaching, but the showing that, look, this is how different it used to be. So sometimes they're like, quite amazed at the developments that way as well. If there are any other questions that you have for Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri, please, feel free to ask. If not, maybe we could wind up then.
Yeah.
Ma'am, do you have any final comments to make? Do you want to say something?
No. Like I said, I was sort of struggling a bit with this, but I wanted to focus on that concept and the context, and I hope it's just a attempt to enter the discussion. Yeah. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
It was not a struggle at all. It was a pleasure listening to you. I'm sure all of us will benefit. Thank you once again, and thank you to the audience also for joining. And we will end the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much.
Come on.